Hello everyone, welcome to another session of AP Human Geography Review with Mr. Elrod. Today we're going to be looking at the internal migration patterns of people within the United States. In one of our other videos we looked at the migration waves to the United States, and today what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the different, not necessarily waves, but different patterns of movement within the United States, and some of the things that cause those internal movements to occur as kind of a general causes, and also look at some general patterns. So the very first type of movement, and that's really the most important within the United States, is a series of interregional movements. Now, the ER here, the inter, is important because when we talk about interregional movements, we're talking about movements that occur between regions. So that's really the most important types of movement that are going to happen initially within the United States, and then at the very end we're going to look at some intraregional movement or movement within regions. So when we look at the initial movement of people within the United States, and if you remember the discussion in your population unit on the population center of the United States, it was highly concentrated on the eastern seaboard, kind of to the north, for a variety of reasons. But one of the main reasons why, aside from economics and trade and things like that, and industrial centers in the east and the north, one of the main reasons why that's the case is because really movement was restricted early on, especially if we look at that maybe colonial period, for a variety of different reasons. So one of the most obvious geographic barriers to movement for people is going to be the Appalachian Mountains. Obviously, with very primitive methods of transportation and roads and things like that, the Appalachian Mountains, even though they're not very large in terms of tall mountain peaks and rugged and things like that, still pose a pretty daunting barrier to early settlers and colonials and things like that, as they were trying to push further west. And people who moved within the Appalachian Mountains and beyond were considered quite remote, and so those would have acted as a geographic barrier. Also, you have to remember that during the colonial periods, the United States was occupied by several different groups of people who weren't always friendly to each other. So whether we're talking about the British, the French, the Spanish, or the Indians, each of them controlled certain sets of territory, and they tried to protect that territory fairly closely. And if the English infringed upon the Spanish infringed upon the English, or the British infringed upon the Indian territories, there was often fighting that was going on. So that was going to keep a lot of people from moving to various parts of the United States and trying to explore and inhabit new parts of the United States. So that initial movement was very limited in terms of the interregional movement. When we go to the 19th century and we look at those migration waves coming to the United States, the movement in the 19th century is going to be greatly aided by new methods of transportation. So of course industrialization is taking place. We have the development of railroads and increased use of railroads in the United States. But not just railroads, you also have canals, which are going to aid movement into the interior of the United States, especially moving into the Chicago area. And so what we begin to see happen is people begin moving from the eastern seaboard out to the west for a variety of different reasons. You have the economic pull that happens, and that economic pull is going to be a variety of different things that we'll look at in just a second. But you have the new industrial cities that begin to crop up. You have new opportunities for farming out in the Midwest. You also have the gold rush that occurs out in the West, California. But also there are certain instances of cultural push. One of the primary examples of that would be the Mormon movement from the East Coast to eventually out to Utah, because of the persecution and the unfriendliness that they find in the eastern portion of the United States. So again, here are just some here are the examples I was talking about. So this east to west movement, you have people moving out to Chicago because of industrialization, also because of its connection to the Midwest and the cattle industry and things like that. If you obviously have the St. Lawrence Seaway, the canal that connects the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean is beneficial to that, but also rail lines that are going to connect Chicago to the east, and then the Midwestern states to Chicago. You have the move to the Midwest as farmers are going out to claim land and to go out and settle new land. Especially we talk about those Germanic farmers coming over to start a new life. Move to the West Coast for things like the gold rush. The Mormons moving to Utah because of religious persecution. When we get to the early 20th century, one of the most important interregional movements is going to is going to revolve around the African American population in the United States. So you have a couple things going on. Obviously, the African slaves were freed as a result of the Civil War, and but not only that. So you had the freed African slaves who, had didn't have the greatest relationship with people in the South. So they found themselves persecuted. Obviously, the laws that were established after the Civil War in the South kept them from being as involved as they might have liked in the society as a whole. Not only that, industrialization begins to take place and continue to take place. So you have the mechanization process happen within farming. That's going to cause the displacement of a lot of the African farmers who were, most of them were tenant farmers because they didn't have enough money to own their own land. So they were tenant farmers or sharecroppers. And so with that, the larger landholders are going to remove their tenant farmers because of the industrialization processes that are taking place. So they're no longer needed. Again, there's the kind of the social element there also, where they want to get away from the past and the things that had happened there in the South. And so you have that push, the economic push, the cultural push, but you also have an economic pull to the northern cities because of industrialization and the need for cheap factory labor. And so that's going to draw them to the north. And so there are actually a variety of different places that the Africans begin to move, and African Americans begin to move to. And you can see here, this is kind of a general map that shows some of the different places they move to, whether it's out to the west coast or to some of these mid-central or these northeastern states. Important to note that they all go to fairly large cities, and again, that's the whole idea of Zelensky's model of migration transition. They're moving long distances, they're going to larger cities, greater opportunities for jobs, but also greater opportunity to be around people who are like themselves, that whole idea of chain migration, but also to find the things that they would want for themselves, the different types of services. They'd be more likely to find those in the larger cities. Some other types of late 20th century movement that we begin to see, the next period of movement that we begin to see, interregional movement. This is going to be in the late 20th century, and this is really what's going on today. So we could say late 20th century, early 21st century. So what's beginning to happen is, as deindustrialization begins to happen, people are going to be moving out of the northeast, kind of the midwestern states, moving to the south and the southwest for a variety of different reasons. Like I said, a lot of it has to do with deindustrialization and an economic push, along with an economic pool that's going to be happening. So with the deindustrialization, you're going to have a loss of a lot of jobs in kind of those northern, north central, midwest, mid-central northern states. And with deindustrialization, you have the union labor force that makes the work in the northern states more expensive. Plus, just the general tax atmosphere on companies and corporations in the northern states. And so because of just the general level of expense, you're going to have a lot of outsourcing, mainly to other countries around the world is where that begins to happen. But what begins to happen as we move forward into the later 20th century is factories begin to move and industry begins to move to the south for a variety of different reasons. You have improvements in education in the south, you have improvement in race relations in the south, you have improvements in infrastructure in the south, and so these things really make the south a lot more attractive than it had been in the past. Plus, it's really cold in the north, and being cold several months out of the year, in fact maybe a majority of the year, isn't exactly all that attractive to a lot of people. And so what we find is that a lot of these northern cities, and you can see here by this proportional symbol map, a lot of these northern cities are beginning to lose a lot of population, and a lot of these southern cities are going to be beginning to gain population. Out in the west, specifically California, you're seeing a lot of loss of population because of increased rates of cost of living and things like that. Now, San Francisco, because of its tech industry, is pulling people into that particular area, but it's only pulling people that typically are able to afford the lifestyle which is aided by the technology industry. And so a lot of this right here is what we've already expressed in the previous slide. So you have these improvements to the south, which I mentioned, improvements in infrastructure, so highways and the major airport, especially like Atlanta Hartsfield, Jackson Airport, improvement in racial tensions, improvement in the education level of the South and the workforce in the South, and then other benefits in the South. You have the improved weather, which is especially going to attract the retirees that are moving from the north into the south. You have a tax advantage because typically taxes are lower, not just income tax, but also taxes on land, corporate taxes, environmental regulations tend to be less, things like that. And then also wages are going to be less because overall cost is less. You're able to pay less wages because cost of living tends to be less, and so all of that is going to cause create a more attractive environment for industry and for jobs. So with that, those are kind of the 4 different periods of interregional movement within the United States. Now we'll move into the primary elements of the intraregional. Now remember, intraregional movement is focused on movement within a region itself, and so not between the different regions. So you have here kind of the different stages of intraregional movement. A lot of this happened relatively rapidly in the United States. So with industrialization, of course, you have the rural to urban movement. Then as time moves on and people in the United States become wealthier, more people can afford cars, more highways are developed, you have the urban to suburban movement. Continuing on, you have the urban to rural movement as kind of the suburban area becomes even more crowded, as the urban area becomes a less desirable place to live. Not only that, more expensive to live. You have this urban to rural movement, this counter-urbanization movement that begins to happen. But then, in our more present day, this is becoming more of a trend, the suburban to urban movement, where a lot of the new generation of the workforce, people just graduating from college, that are in their early 20s, early 30s, either single or newly married, a lot of them are moving. Maybe they lived in the suburbs growing up. They really want the urban lifestyle is kind of nostalgic for them. I don't know why they'd be nostalgic. Maybe that's a poor choice of words, but there's something enticing about coming to the urban area and living the urban lifestyle. So the movement back to the urban areas and improving those particular areas. So that's where we get the elements of gentrification, people wanting to develop this idea of new urbanism, which we discussed in one of the other lecture videos. So definitely an interesting trend here. So a lot of these things are actually going on at the same time. The 2 types of movement that are most frequent are going to be the urban to suburban movement, where people are wanting to start families and be in areas that are less dense, and then the suburban to urban movement with the improvement of the urban center, this idea of gentrification, and also as new urbanism develops, this will probably attract and draw more people. And of course, with the suburban to urban movement, you typically get greater costs in living because of the improvements in the area. So costs are going to go up as a result of that. So a couple points to remember as we wrap up here, especially in the United States, and I guess this is true for every place, but in the United States this may be the most, not necessarily profound, but has evidenced itself very greatly. Transportation is going to be really important because it allows greater access and interaction between spaces, which allows for the high development of suburbanization. So you have to be independently wealthy, independently mobile to allow a lot of these developments to happen. But also economic change is going to play a great role. As we move from an industrial to a post-industrial society, it frees up companies and corporations to make changes in terms of where it is that they're going to locate themselves. And I think one of the best examples of this is this whole ad campaign that Houston had going on, this idea that Houston is hip, attracting people because of the quality of life that can be found in Houston because of the types of industries that it's trying to draw, mainly the technology industries. And so that doesn't really require the huge amount of infrastructure that the old industries used to require. So that's all that we have for today. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email, and I hope to see you next time.